Well, let's get started. Thanks, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thanks for joining. As Sarah said, I'm Ewout Pronk, and I work for NetNumber. And today I want to talk you through the latest implications of the FCC ruling, and in particular the impact of the ruling for both national as well as international calls. So, the session overview. For the ones who really don't know, and I doubt if there are still any people on this planet who don't know what are the impact of robocalls, but just in case, let's start with that. Then I will talk you through the December 2020 Traced Act order. A few slides to discuss the national perspective of this December traced order. We talk about reasonable robocall measures and what are challenges with these measures. Then we move to the international perspective. And here I would like to discuss the different types of calls we have in the international perspective and the challenges and impact of these international calls. And then we finish with how STIRSHAKEN could possibly extend it over the international border. And we finish then with wrap up and takeaways. And of course, I'm happy to take questions after the webinar. All right, impact of robocalls. Yeah, the conclusion is right in front of you. At this stage, we feel as an industry that the public telephone network is really broken. So robocalls are very impacting. So US customers receive over 200,000 unwanted calls every minute. And of those calls, 47 are really illegal scams. So customers are losing a lot of money. And you see some figures here. For instance, of those who were scammed, the average loss is $244 US per victim. And fraudsters spoof the caller ID to increase the likelihood that the call will be answered. So at this stage, over 88% of the customers, and this is increasing, won't answer unknown calls. And with customer awareness on the rise, even legitimate calls get unanswered by now, which is of course pretty bad. So my bold conclusion here is that the public telephone network is broken. If you compare it to OTT players, you would see there that the CLI is always trustworthy. It's an end-to-end call between customers who have the same app. In most of the cases, this call is for free. If you would not like to speak to anybody any longer, you can simply block that person. So from a customer perspective, despite all the privacy impact of such OTT apps, you can almost say they would feel more comfortable at this stage using an OTT app than the public telephony network. And of course, for us as an industry, that is really, really bad. Okay, let's move to the Traced Act order itself very briefly. So in December 2020, the FCC released its latest Robocall Abuse, Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence Act, Traced. The new order encourages communication service providers in the US to block unwanted calls by extending the methods for such blocking and to fix those erroneous blocked calls. And the last point, this particular order has really far-reaching consequences for both domestic and also for international calls. So in this webinar, I would really like to take the time to explain what that impact is for domestic and international calls and what is the different impact between the two. Okay, this is a quick summary of what the order entails. So the first one is the voice service providers are required to stop illegal traffic on their networks and track down callers who make such illegal calls. Secondly, to expand the safe harbor to include network-based blocking based on what they call reasonable analytics, to identify calls that are likely to be illegal, and to manage this blocking with human oversight and network monitoring to ensure that the blocking works as intended. So part of the presentation is about this second point, where I won't go too much into details of the first and the third point. The third point is that voice service providers are required to block calls, establish a dispute resolution process to correct erroneous blocking, and promptly resolve disputes. Now, if you read this major points of the trace order as it stands, you can see that either of those three, next to, implementing STIRSHAKEN, which is already quite costly and mandatory for a service provider, that each of these bullets, you see that this is also very labor-intensive work, all of them. So this means that next to the technical measures and investing in a network, it's also very labor-intensive to track down those calls, to have a reasonable analytics system to block robocalls and to follow up any mistakes that you make. So the impact here is quite high. So all carriers on national level, if they implement STIRSHAKEN, then the world would be 100% SIP by mid of 2021. We would then reach the end of CLI spoofing, right? Well, unfortunately not. This is really a fairy tale. So you see a number of points here that have definitely impact, and what makes sure that actually by the mid of 2021 there will be still room for robocalls. We would see that some carriers will not, even if they try to make the deadline for the SIP portion of their network. There's a lot of TDM traffic without STIRSHAKEN built in, so there are discussions about out-of-band STIRSHAKEN and how that should be handled, but it's far from finished. There will be outbound roamers with a North American number plan number calling home. This can also be quite impacting. There will be enterprises, national enterprises, but also international BPO enterprises using foreign numbers, but also using US numbers. And there will be calls from non-US fixed lines, enterprises, and mobile numbers calling to the US. And this all has a big impact. And there will also be robocalls from abroad, where it's sometimes quite hard to judge if these are actually robocalls or not. So despite all the measures, there is still a lot of work to do, and there's also still a lot of room for robocalls. So the STIRSHAKEN measures and robocall blocking measures will always coexist. You can say at this stage, while carriers are building STIRSHAKEN solutions, that this is the smaller portion at this stage, as of March 2021. So some operators start to work with STIRSHAKEN. But most of the robocall problems need to be solved with this robocall mitigation program. And even if the STIRSHAKEN implementation will increase over time, so I put here tomorrow, but let's say the end of this year, you would see that there's maybe a bit less need for robocall mitigation programs next to STIRSHAKEN, but still this is absolutely necessary. Even in a 100% STIRSHAKEN world, it is still very important, in particular on the origination side, to detect and block robocalls. So both will coexist over time. It might just be that the robocall mitigation program will be smaller and smaller when we move into let's say 2022 or 2023. So let's move to the national perspective of the impact of the traced order. So basically there are 4 different call flows what you can have. So the first one is the originator supports STIRSHAKEN. This means that the originator has an optional robocall mitigation program. This is not mandatory. If your network supports fully STIRSHAKEN, there's no need for this robocall mitigation program, although it is heavily recommended. And then on the receiving side, if you support STIRSHAKEN, or even in general, on the receiving side, the robocall mitigation program is optional. The second case is where the sender supports STIRSHAKEN, but the receiver does not support STIRSHAKEN. Also in this case, maybe surprisingly, okay, the sender has an optional robocall mitigation program, but also the receiver, because the mandate of mandatory robocall mitigation program only lies with the sender and not with the receiver. But of course, we can say that tackling robocalls on the termination side is optional, but it's really recommended to do to protect your own customers. A third case is when the sender doesn't have STIRSHAKEN support. In this case, there will be this mandated robocall mitigation program. That means that the sender needs to have some kind of system or architecture that is able to prevent and detect robocalls. This is an absolute must. And the fourth one is from that sender that has no STIRSHAKEN support. So there's the mandated side on the sender side, and there's the optional robocall mitigation program on the receiving side. There's something else next to robocall mitigation program, and that is called certification. Each carrier handling North American number plan numbers, being it originators, being it transit providers or termination provider, all have to file for a certification program that explains your strategy around robocalling. So it has, for instance, to explain how you tackle robocalling on the portions of your network where there's STIRSHAKEN and on the portions of the network where there isn't STIRSHAKEN. It also implies that blocking of calls from the North American number plan arriving from uncertified SPs applies to all other SPs too. So if a service provider receives a call from an entity that isn't certified, this call should be dropped. And that is, of course, quite impacting. Sorry, one step back. So to me, sometimes it is a bit hard to understand from the regulation. What do they mean with uncertified SPs? If there isn't a STIRSHAKEN signature, the only thing you would know, because these calls are going over the voice network hop by hop, is the previous hop. So if the previous hop doesn't have certification, you should drop the call. If there is a STIRSHAKEN signature present, you actually know who signed the call. So does that mean that you actually should look at the originator of the call and not the previous hop, and then judge, does this sender have a certification or not? At this stage, this is quite unclear in the regulation what should be done. Is it the previous hop, or when you know that when there's a STIRSHAKEN signature, should you also look at the sender, if that sender is certified? So that's actually an open question at this stage. Okay, so then if you have such a robocall mitigation program, then the regulation speaks about reasonable analytics. And this term is, of course, a bit difficult, because what does it mean? What is reasonable from this perspective? So I give my own statement here. I would say that you create a system or methodology that can detect and prevent robocalls, very important, in real time, with a low percentage of false negatives or false positives, and a high percentage of true negatives and true positives. And of course, this is already complex on its own, because what is now more impacting? Is it the false positive, or is it the false negative? So are you blocking calls which aren't robocalls, or are you actually letting robocalls through that you should have blocked, right? This balance at this stage is nowhere documented. This is really up to the operator to have such a system in place. And we think that if you have such a system in place, this will not automatically all work by its own. You need people to look at the results and to correct things, etc. So even if you have systems who do this work, this is still very labor intensive. So how to come to reasonable analytics? Well, we think this kind of analytics should be based on 3 different pillars, which are industry data, traffic data, and customer data. So you have them right here. So industry data, you can see as a list of known numbers that are already known in the industry, used for robocalling. So such lists you can decide to dynamically upload to your system, so to make sure that something that is really obvious is going to be blocked. The second one is customer data. If you are on the originating site where the regulation is actually about, it would be good to also understand, if you have that information, who the customer is. For instance, if there is a thorough vetting procedure to even become a customer of that network, and other information from CRM systems that would help you in finding clues if this call can be a robocall or not. And of course, the third very important pillar is the traffic data itself. So based on the signaling data, you can basically start to limit calls dynamically, which have the pattern of a robocall. For this, you really need to look close into the signaling as well, to, for instance, not mix up robocalling and Wangiri. Wangiri is also a fraud case, but it's definitely different than robocalling. And also, of course, the risk is here that lots of the calls which have the robocalling signature are not illegal calls, but only unwanted calls. And those calls, of course, is the intention that you should not block such calls. So this is a very tight balance, even if you have the traffic data, to make sure that you are blocking the right calls. The international perspective then, that might be even more complex than the national perspective. Let's quickly look at the statement of the CTIA regarding foreign provider prohibition. So the FCC prohibits intermediate providers and terminating voice providers from accepting voice traffic directly from any service provider that does not appear in the database, including foreign service providers that uses the non-American number plan resources. And the FCC explained that this would create a very strong incentive for such foreign voice calls to file certifications. The last sentence is probably true, but it also goes with a lot of impact to the ecosystem, which I will try to explain in the next slides. So the international perspective isn't only about calls arriving from the North American Numbering Plan CLIs. This is also about all international calls that are going towards the US. So we have a few on those slides. The first case is the US roamers. So these are US numbers that are roaming elsewhere and then calling home. So those calls are including in the regulations as they are American numbers. And so, as I said, this regulation should apply. Of course, there are also other roamers in certain networks. So roaming non-US subs, they can also make calls to the USA. Then there are local subs, so the non-roaming subs of a mobile network. There will be fixed traffic connected to certain MNOs. There will be enterprises connected, and there also might be other telcos that send traffic through MNOs. And of course, if you look at the regulation, how it stands today, and if there wouldn't be any certification, then all these calls will automatically end up with attestation C, which means that the network at the edge of the realm of the US won't have any information about the authenticity of the CLI, and so this would result in a caller setup with caller unverified. For the non-American numbers, this is already problematic because customers will get used to this fancy check marks with verified calls. But for the roamers roaming outside the US, for instance in Europe, this problem is much worse. If a customer is in the US and it calls his friend with the STIRSHAKEN regulation implemented, you will probably see this nice check mark with a verified call. Now, if that same person goes on holiday to Europe and he will call his friends again, his friend would get at this stage a caller unverified with the number of his friend. So he would be then quite suspicious because like 2 days ago, he had this verified check mark. So all the roaming subs, so case number 1, we qualify as a very important use case to get solved and to see how that can fit with the regulation that is coming up. Yeah, so what to do with the roamers abroad? Again, foreign service providers that use those US numbers and sending traffic to the US must follow the same certification requirements as domestic voice service providers in order to be listed in the database. And this is going to be quite a complex thing to solve. Also, here is the question: handling North American number plan numbers, are these like transit carriers on the way to the US, or is this only the originating carrier, which you cannot even judge because the US roamer would move around in, for instance, Europe. So you never know without a STIRSHAKEN signature which MSC or switch or network has actually sent the call. And if you are aware how international calling works, there might be 10 to 15 hops in between calls that come from a certain network that arrive in the US. So what does this mean? Do they all need to get certified one by one? That's going to be quite difficult. And of course, also there's different regulation. Europe isn't regulated by the FCC, right? So if you look at this drawing there with the circle of influence, circle of control, and circle of concern, the FCC circle of influence is really the regulation of the US service providers, and anything that is happening outside is more in the circle of influence, that is a try, or in the circle of concern. So again, FCC cannot regulate the whole world. They can only regulate the carrier at the edge coming into the US. And that one will have a huge problem with, because it will get loads of uncertified calls, and to comply with the regulation, it has no other choice than to drop that call. So what we could say is the entire international voice ecosystem isn't really designed to be able to comply with this regulation. It's just too complex. There are too many hops and there are too many uncertainties. So what will be mitigation strategies? Well, the first one is VoLTE roaming or 5G roaming. When you do voice over LTE for inbound roamers, which is one of the most problematic cases, as I explained, if you move from the circuit switch calls to the voice over LTE calls, that actually means that when a subscriber from the US is roaming in, let's say in France, that the call will go on a data channel, so not on the voice channel, to the home network. And in the home network, the call will come out of the IMS. In this case, it is perfectly safe to put A attestation to the call because the call arrives in the home PLMN of the roamer. And that roamer has the customer relationship and has authenticated the data channel towards the visited network. And the same goes for 5G. It isn't called voice over LTE, slightly different, but the idea is exactly the same. The call will arrive on the data channel to the home network. There it comes out of the IMS, and from there you can safely put A attestation. So this is a good mitigation strategy, but it will take very long. First of all, you need VoLTE roaming between networks. So some networks have already a VoLTE roaming agreement with US providers, but there are also still a lot of operators in the world that do not have this VoLTE roaming agreement. And secondly, the phone needs to support voice over LTE as well. You really need a newer smartphone to make use of this voice over LTE. So this is a mitigation strategy, but we can say that it's going to take a lot of time before this would have any substantial impact to the problem. The second strategy is different. This is about international STIRSHAKEN support. So the idea is that instead of the entire planet complying to the FCC regulation, would it not make more sense to create trust and to interconnect secure domains? And I just put a few logos here that make sense to create such interworking between secure domains. So you probably know from CRTC and in Canada that there are already talks going on how such trust can be created to interconnect those secure domains. But there can be others. For instance, the European Union can have an initiative to create a secure domain and make sure that then safely calls can be connected towards the US. So on the right side, there's, for instance, i3 Forum, and there's also the GSMA. And I will have a few slides on some developments in the GSMA on this topic. So what it does, this interconnecting secure domains, is that it provides a lot of scalability. So those operators that are in another secure domain, being it in Canada and the CRTC or GSMA members, they do not all have to speak and to certify, to get certified by FCC. Instead, they speak to their own body, and parties like the GSMA then have to get in contact with FCC to see, that's very important, how to create enough trust that those calls arriving from, for instance, GSMA members can be trusted within the governed STIRSHAKEN realm in the USA. All right, so if you wouldn't have that, you have the situation without STIRSHAKEN, which you can see here from left to right. So Alice makes a call. Let's say she's in the UK. It goes to the mobile operator, then maybe to the mobile group where the operator is belonging to. It arrives at the border in the US. So even if there would be certification, let's assume that this is all done by the mobile group as well as by the mobile opco, still the transit SP has no other choice to put attestation C, because it has no idea if Alice really belongs to the mobile opco and if the CLI is authentic. So Bob will get a disappointing result because that STIRSHAKEN signature will be verified, but it's only the one that was set in transit. And this would lead to a call setup where the caller is unverified. So how would it be with STIRSHAKEN? So with STIRSHAKEN, this STIRSHAKEN signature should be set earlier in the process. I put it here in the mobile group where the mobile operator belongs to, but of course that does not necessarily have to be the case. It can be the mobile opco as well, but there are several ideas and discussions for better scalability. If, for instance, a mobile group can do this for a mobile operator, if there would be separate trunks between the mobile opco and the mobile group for attestation A calls, then it can be the mobile group that can then sign the call with attestation A. In this case, it's absolutely crucial that the mobile opco does the right thing. So it doesn't put any calls in this different trunk that aren't attestation A, because then the whole system would collapse and wouldn't work any longer. But let's assume that's not the case. Then the call will be signed before arriving to the US. You have authenticated CLI all the way, and the call will be verified, and Bob will see the famous check mark on his screen. The beauty of this strategy, as a difference to strategy number one, is that this would work also for calls not being part of the North American number plan. So this can also be European numbers, fixed lines, whatever is required here, where mitigation strategy 1 would only look at the inbound roamers and nothing else. So let's explain a bit on developments currently going on in the GSMA. So originally, to launch 5G roaming, the GSMA is preparing a key management procedure to exchange key material between GSMA members. So this is ongoing work with already results. And the GSMA is currently looking at how we extend that trust to other secure domains, such as FCC governed STIRSHAKEN. So what you see here in the picture on the right side, we have then GSMA members. And let's assume that there will be a designated certificate authority that is trusted within the realm of the FCC. That is quite crucial. And does their work on behalf of the GSMA to get certificates signed from different GSMA members. And of course, to create that trust, those international GSMA members need to go through a quite strong vetting procedure to make sure that they are trustworthy, that they know what they do, that it's really clear that attestation A is attestation A, etc. So if all these things can be done, then you can start to sign calls from GSMA members towards the US, and they would then be, hopefully for attestation A, be presented on the other side with attestation A as well. So the beauty is that all the service providers in the world, they do not have to do anything for the FCC one by one. They only need to talk to the GSMA in an internal procedure to get their certificate signed by a certificate authority that is then trusted by the FCC. So there's work to do here for both GSMA and FCC in this case to create this trust. Without this trust, this just won't work. But if this trust can be established, I think that is in the benefit of all. It's in the benefit of the FCC, it's in the benefit of the US service providers, and it's also in the benefit of the GSMA members. So this is ongoing work in the GSMA where is being looked at this stage. This is a concept that we call in the GSMA currently STIR mixer. So I need to explain a few things here. The core of the GSMA roaming data exchange is so-called IR21 document. So each operator of the GSMA has an IR21 document, and this IR21 document is full of information about this operator, including global titles and other things. So the idea is that if this IR21 would also contain public key certificates that are trusted in the North America STIRSHAKEN domain, as I just explained, then you would have a call. In this slide is from right to left. That means that the call is going to be signed by the certificate that is being published in IR21, and that certificate should also be available in the public domain, so that also the North American STIRSHAKEN provider has access to that certificate. And if that certificate is signed by a trusted CA for this particular purpose, then this call can be trusted and the CLI can possibly be presented with attestation A. So we're still thinking about different paths how to do that. I can only say at this stage that IR21 documentation isn't public, so there needs to be a step done that if there are certificates being published in this IR21 documents, that part of that documentation is public, so that it's possible for the North American STIRSHAKEN provider to verify that signature and to check if the call is authentic. Takeaways. Well, the first one that might be disappointing, but I think you all agree that robocalls will not go away, whatever we do. Even if we have STIRSHAKEN, we still have a big problem with international calls. We have a problem with networks that have only TDM, etc. So we can mitigate robocalls in the industry to a certain extent. That's good news, but they just won't go entirely away. And to mitigate robocalls, a combination of STIRSHAKEN and a robocall mitigation program, shall exist on the originating side and preferably also on the terminating side. Whatever we can do to solve this problem should be done. Regulating the entire world under a US mandate simply does not work. The international voice ecosystem, it's just too complex to cope with this. You have all the originating operators that use North American numbering plan numbers for roaming. Those roamers move around, and then when they make calls to the US, there can be 10 to 15 hops in between. So if you all want to regulate that, where you have a mandate that doesn't count in this particular jurisdiction, then that's simply not gonna work. And of course, you can put that in the regulation. Well, if operators do not comply, we have to drop all the calls, but that also won't be a solution because then customers cannot make calls any longer. So we need to think about different ideas in the industry, how to work together with this mandate, such as VoLTE and 5G roaming, as well as international STIRSHAKEN. And that was my last point here. Interworking and creating trust between other domains might then just be the only way forward to tackle this problem from the international perspective. All right, this was my last slide. So thank you very much for listening to this webinar, and maybe now over to you, Sarah, to see if there's any questions.